On our anniversary, my boyfriend posted a tweet. Time flies. It's already been 9 years in the blink of an eye. I liked it. And then, the tweet disappeared almost instantly. I didn't think much of it until I accidentally saw his phone. A friend had commented under that tweet, "It's been 9 years and you still haven't forgotten her?" I glanced at the photo of her and was shocked. She looked exactly like me. It turned out, the 9th year he was commemorating was never about me. It was about his goddess, Diana. Later, I left without a word. It wasn't until I was about to get married that I learned he'd been desperately searching for me for 10 years. Chapter 1. It was the 9th anniversary of our relationship. Like always, he booked a restaurant, brought roses, and gave me an expensive necklace. Midway through dinner, he suddenly rushed out to take a call. When he returned, he just muttered, "Something urgent came up at work. I have to go deal with it now." Then he left. I was alone, sitting there with a table full of steaks, pasta, and dessert, not wanting it to go to waste. I called my best friend over to join me. Noticing I looked upset, Anna tried to comfort me. "Don't be sad. Cameron just got promoted to regional GM. It's natural for him to be busier now. Besides, even with his workload, he still tweeted about your 9th anniversary." I pulled out my phone. Sure enough, Cameron had just posted a tweet 3 minutes ago. Time flies. It's already been 9 years. My eyes welled up with warmth. I liked the post and was just about to comment. "Where did you even find this photo? I don't remember ever taking one like that." But the next second, the tweet vanished. Just then, Anna frowned and asked, "When did you take this picture? It looks like you, but not quite." I can't explain why. Just something feels off. She handed me her phone. It was a screenshot of Cameron's now-deleted tweet. At first glance, it really did look like me. But the more I looked, the more I saw a fragile, broken softness in the girl's expression, whereas in mine, there was always a kind of quiet strength. A look carved by time. Not my own words, but what many collaborators have said about me. After 10 years of fighting my way through the corporate world, that strength has helped me dominate every project I touched. I zoomed in on the photo. Then again, and again, until I saw it. A rose tattoo on her right index finger. I glanced down at my own hand. Nothing. My heart sank. I asked Anna to send me the screenshot. After saving it, I called Cameron. It rang for a long time. No answer. I called again. Still no response. Anna noticed my expression darkening and said, "Let me drive you home." Okay. I got into her car and rode in silence. Outside, it was pouring. The sound of rain surrounded me as I stared blankly at that photo on my phone. She wasn't me, but she looked so much like me. Or maybe I looked like her. I was just about to call Cameron again, when the door suddenly opened. Cameron came in, soaked to the bone. Chapter 2. You're back? I asked calmly, sitting on the sofa in the unlit room. But my fingers, tightly gripping the phone, ached faintly from the pressure. I tried to keep my tone neutral as I asked the question I needed to ask. At the very least, before the truth was confirmed, I didn't want to act like some hysterical woman. However, Cameron merely grunted in response and headed straight into the bathroom. The sound of running water echoed from inside. For the first time, I picked up Cameron's phone. I opened WeChat. That post was still there, just set to be invisible to me. Beneath that post were comments from Cameron's friends. "Damn, Diana's back? She can't see this post, right? No way. Cameron, it's been 9 years, and you still haven't moved on from her?" Under that last comment, Cameron had replied with just one word. Yeah. That simple word hit me like a 1,000-pound weight dropping from the sky, shattering my heart into pieces. Suddenly, I felt unbelievably foolish. I'm 30 years old. I've always been honest and open-hearted with people. Yet the person I sleep beside turned out to be using me as a substitute for someone else. Isn't that foolish enough? Had there really been no signs of the truth? Every time I instinctively let my hair down, his frown, why didn't I pay attention to that? He'd say, "You should tie it up. It looks better that way." Whenever I leaned toward black and gray outfits, Didn't he always suggest red? Veronica, your personality's already kind of distant. Wearing black and gray makes you seem even colder. Red makes you look warmer. I'm not someone who bends over backwards to please others. But when it came to my partner, I always tried to be as accommodating as possible. And so, I gradually got used to tying up my hair, and more red dresses found their way into my closet. I thought there was nothing wrong with doing things that made my partner happy. After all, when I mentioned how I liked men in suits, Cameron started keeping his on after work, despite how uncomfortable it must have been after a whole day, patting his thigh and saying, "Veronica, come sit, that cold." Domineering aura he gave off always pulled me in, so much so that I couldn't even get out of bed the next morning. But looking back now, those moments always happened when I was wearing a red dress, with my hair tied up. I used to think it was just Cameron's personal aesthetic quirk. Now I understand. It was about a woman he'd been obsessed with for 9 years. Her name was Diana. Looking at the photo of her, hair tied just like mine, wearing the same kind of red dress, I never imagined I'd one day find myself living out one of those substitute lover cliches. My chest hurt, a deep, stabbing ache, as I held my hand over my heart. I heard the click of a door opening. Cameron stepped out. Chapter 3. Who is she? I asked Cameron, pointing at the screenshot on the phone. Cameron froze. He didn't answer me right away. Instead, he said, "Let me get dressed first." I sat calmly on the sofa, waiting as he changed clothes, not into pajamas, but into a fresh suit. He leaned down and gripped my shoulders. "Veronica, trust me, she's just a friend. She just came back to the country, doesn't know many people, and asked me to pick her up." Cameron didn't even wait for me to respond. He straightened his tie, grabbed the umbrella from the side table, and headed straight for the door. I spoke up. "Cameron, I hope you don't regret this." I clenched my back teeth, forcing the words out, but Cameron merely paused for a second before opening the door and walking out. The rain outside was growing heavier. I listened to his footsteps fade into the distance. I started trembling uncontrollably. My teeth chattered violently. I put on a thick winter coat, then wrapped myself in a heavy blanket. But I was still cold. So cold. I took my temperature. I had a high fever. For the first time, I realized that when someone mentally collapses, their body can instantly follow. The thermometer read 40 degrees Celsius. I was dizzy and dazed, and the first person I thought of was still Cameron. I sent him a photo of the thermometer reading. "It's raining too hard to hail a ride, and I doubt you've gotten far yet. Can you take me to the hospital first?" This time, Cameron replied quickly, but what he said was, "Don't be dramatic, Veronica. Let's talk when I get back." My teeth were still chattering as I messaged him back. "Cameron, I'm not being dramatic. I really have a fever. Please, I'm begging you, come back." But that message sank into silence, like a fallen leaf drifting across the ocean. No reply. I tried to hail a ride using an app, just as I feared. Nothing available. My own car was in the shop for maintenance. To be honest, even if my car had been in the garage right now, how could I risk someone else's life by driving in that state? I called Anna. "Are you okay?" Anna stayed with me at the hospital. "Do you want me to call Cameron?" "I mean, no matter what's going on, you are his girlfriend." My lips were pale as I shook my head silently. "But Veronica, are you really just going to end it like this? 9 years. Veronica, if it weren't for you, would Cameron even have the life he has now? Now he's richer than you, more powerful, and he just throws you aside? How is that fair?" Anna clenched her jaw. "At the very least, someone should beat his ass. That's the only way I'd feel better." I waved my hand weakly and gave a bitter smile. "How do you wake someone who's pretending to sleep?" "The answer is, you never can." I didn't want to keep dragging this on. That's not who I am, not Veronica. My heart was shattered into pieces. I had nothing left in me. "Cameron, as cliché as this all sounds, Cameron, I think our child is incredibly unlucky to have chosen now to come into our lives." Chapter 4. I stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Cameron didn't call me once, not a single message. In the end, it was me who messaged him. "Cameron, can we talk?" He replied, "Veronica, Work's been crazy these past few days. Diana isn't doing well either, and she needs someone with her. I saw Anna's post, since she's with you. I feel at ease. Give me a few more days, okay? Let me get through this. Wait, that word again. Back in our 4th year together, I'd brought up the topic of marriage with Cameron. My parents were pressuring me, and I loved Cameron. I wanted to settle down. What did he say at the time? Veronica, my career's still unstable. Can you wait a little longer? I don't want to drag you down. At that point, I was already in senior management. Cameron had just been promoted to a junior supervisor. I understood the pride of a man wanting to appear strong in front of the woman he loves. So I waited 2 more years. In our 6th year, I brought up marriage again, and this time, Cameron said, Veronica, I've just entered upper management. My position isn't secure yet. If I get married now, people might say my personal life is interfering with work. They could use that against me. I remember being disappointed, but I loved Cameron. Love made me back down again. Later, I found out Cameron didn't ask me to wait because of his life. He asked me to wait because Diana asked him to wait. She told him to wait 10 years. And Cameron, he used up 9 years of my life waiting for her. If it weren't for that WeChat post slipping through his privacy settings, I have no doubt he would have let me wait all 10 years. If Diana had agreed to fulfill that 10-year promise, he would have kicked me to the curb. And if she hadn't, maybe he would have just settled for marrying me. No one knew that behind our relationship, there was this whole twisted setup. But it doesn't matter anymore. I'm leaving with nothing but exhaustion. Chapter 5. I returned home and looked around the place we had lived in for 9 years. Every corner was filled with shadows of me and Cameron. I started in our bedroom. Half the closet was mine. I began packing up the clothes that had been with me through so much. The red dresses, I hung them up, one by one. The black and gray ones, I folded them carefully, neatly, and placed them into my suitcase. When I was done, I stared at the closet for a while. The left half was filled with Cameron's dark-colored clothes. The right half, filled with the red clothes he liked. In my mind, I could see Cameron standing on the left, and Diana on the right. This strange little fantasy, I bet Cameron's imagined it too. He must have longed for that kind of life, a home where one side belonged to him, and the other to Diana. But how unfortunate, for these 9 years, it was me occupying that space. I'm sure Cameron had thought about this over and over again. Next, I went into the study. I loved reading more than Cameron did, after all. Besides being a corporate executive, I'm also a writer, so most of the books in the study were mine. I packed up over a dozen huge boxes. When the movers Anna had called came to take them away, the study looked like it had been looted. All that was left were a few scattered romance novels I never cared for. I picked one up, casually flipped through it. There was a handwritten note on the title page. From Diana. Ah, so that's what this is. Because it was a gift from Diana. Cameron had flipped through it, again and again. The worn, fluffy pages let me imagine exactly how he would have touched it when he missed her. Caressing the paper, like he was caressing her body. I laughed at myself, bitterly, and placed the books neatly back on the shelf. The entire wall, no trace of me left. Only Diana remained. Isn't that exactly what Cameron wanted? Then, I made my way to the kitchen. Chapter 6. When I stepped into the kitchen, I thought about the love Cameron once showed me. I remembered during the pandemic, when I said I needed to isolate somewhere else. And he stopped me. Veronica, we're partners. Taking care of you is my responsibility. He helped me lie down, boiled water, made food, and whenever I woke up groggy in the middle of the night, murmuring just one word, thirsty, Cameron would immediately hand me a glass of water. Drink, Veronica, have some water. You'll feel better. During those 3 years of lockdown, he never once let me go out to stock up on supplies. It's too dangerous out there. Veronica, let me do it. I'm strong. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, thinking and rethinking everything. During those years, I had no time to carefully tie up my hair, no energy to wear red dresses again. So, did Cameron truly love me during that time? The thought made my heart ache again. Anna said I seemed calm, but she doesn't understand. A woman's calm can sometimes mean her heart is already dead. And when the heart dies, even tears won't come. Cameron, can you understand that? Chapter 7. While I was lost in thought, the cake artist I'd booked arrived. In this house we'd lived in for 9 years. I began learning how to bake the first birthday cake for the child I never had a chance to bring into this world. A sea blue cake, layered with white cream, just like the ocean waves off Boracay. I remember Cameron once said that if we ever had a child, on the very day we found out, we'd bake a cake just like this together. I had drawn the original design. I chose the ocean blue base. Cameron had come up with a beautiful idea to layer the frosting into waves of cream. And now, I've made that cake. But where are you, Cameron? I placed the finished cake in the fridge and left a note. No matter what, Cameron, when you see this cake, please light a candle for our child. After that, I cleaned the kitchen and returned to the living room. I sat there in silence until evening. I watched the sun set through the window, and then I watched the moon rise. And I understood then, the person I'd been waiting for was never coming back. 9 years of longing for a memory was far more powerful than 9 years of compromise with me. Goodbye, Cameron. I stood up, dragging my suitcase. When I reached the side table, I saw a framed photo of me and Cameron. There was nothing left in this home that belonged to us anymore. So I left that photo for him. Tear it up, or toss it in the trash. I don't care, because my heart has already sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Chapter 8. I accepted a job offer from a company all the way in the United States and officially resigned from my old employer back home. As the plane took off, I received a call from HR at my previous company. Veronica, I felt it was necessary to inform you, Cameron, the CEO of Dajin Group, called and asked if you were on a business trip. I figured you probably hadn't told him about your resignation, so I thought I'd check with you before saying anything. I thanked her. Just tell him I'm on a business trip. Don't mention anything else. All right, I'll go with that then. After hanging up, I glanced at my phone. A flood of messages from Cameron had come in. Veronica, why aren't you picking up your phone? Are you out of the hospital already? What's going on with you? Why won't you tell me anything? You're not still mad at me, are you? I told you. She's just a friend. This is just a temporary thing. Come on. She just went through a breakup and had a miscarriage. We're classmates. I was just helping her out. Veronica, you're a high-level executive at a listed company. Surely you're not that petty? Oh, just called your company. They said you were on a business trip. So you must be feeling better. That's a relief. Take care while you're away. We'll talk when you get back. Love you. I looked at the messages and felt like they came from a different lifetime. More accurately, I felt like these messages were meant for someone else entirely. That Cameron had simply sent them to the wrong person. So, I deleted them all with a single tap, turned off my phone, and boarded the plane. Chapter 9. After landing, I tossed my old phone into a drawer and started using the new one the company gave me. Finding a place to live, adapting to the new team, I was so busy I barely touched the ground. This American company had been courting me for a long time, offering triple the salary I earned back home. At the time, I turned them down, thinking living abroad would be too hard. But they never gave up on me. Now, with me finally accepting, it felt like a two-way pursuit fulfilled. And honestly, for the first time, I felt a bit grateful that Cameron chose his goddess instead of me. In just about 3 days, I had my work completely on track. Finally, I could take a breather. I opened the drawer and pulled out my old phone from back home. There were a lot of photos I couldn't bear to delete. I planned to erase the ones with Cameron, but the ones of myself? Not a chance. I loved every single one. As soon as I turned the phone on, it was flooded with thousands of messages from Cameron. It nearly crashed the phone. Veronica, what is this? Where are the books from the study? What happened to your clothes in the wardrobe? I thought you were just on a business trip. Reply to me. Veronica, there's really nothing going on with Diana. I admit we were together before, but that's over. It's you I care about now. When are you coming back? Just send me one message, even just a single word, so I know you're okay. Please? Don't be mad anymore. I'm begging you. There were so many messages. I didn't even bother reading through them all. I scrolled lazily, ready to shut it off again, when a newer message caught my eye. Veronica, are we having a baby? Please. For the 9 years we've been together, just tell me, is the baby still there? Veronica, I'm begging you. That word, baby, stabbed me right in the heart. I clenched the phone so hard it hurt. My parents came over and gently patted my shoulder. The company had agreed to sponsor family reunion visas, so they moved to the US with me. Besides them, the only person who knew where I'd gone after resigning was Anna. But she had already blocked and deleted all of Cameron's contact info, and had taken a job in Northern Europe. I, on the other hand, had been too busy after arriving to delete Cameron. But it didn't matter anymore. I pulled out the SIM card directly, as I was about to uninstall WeChat. My hand accidentally tapped on another app. It opened to the smart home surveillance system, the one from when Cameron and I lived together. My parents had gone for a walk, leaving me curled up alone on the couch. It was a rare moment of rest, so I grabbed a big bag of chips, tore it open, and started watching the footage. The first video was from 3 days ago. I realized that was the day I landed in the US. The same day Cameron had called my old company, and HR told him I was on a business trip. Seeing that home again through the screen felt surreal. For a moment, I genuinely questioned whether I had actually lived in that house for 9 years with a man. There was no trace of me left, except on the side table, where the framed photo of Cameron and me still stood. A moment later, I heard the electronic lock beep open. That face, I could recognize it anywhere. Cameron, wearing a suit, looking polished, like the kind of male lead from a TV drama that's almost too good-looking to be real. I shoved a handful of chips in my mouth. Delicious. A must-have when watching drama. Highly recommend everyone keep a bag on hand. Then, another person entered. Red dress. Hair tied up. Yep, Diana. I took a sip of soda. So, the new lady of the house. Huh? She really was beautiful. When Cameron bought that house, I bet the woman he imagined sharing it with was Diana. No doubt. I looked more closely at Diana. The brokenness in her eyes stirred something strange in me, a kind of protectiveness. Even as a fellow woman, not like me, I act fast and clean. People say I have sharp eyes and a sharper will, that I'm a battlefield commander in the business world. What a joke. If that weren't true, how else would I have become regional executive director at such a young age? I shoved another handful of chips into my mouth. Tomato flavor, my favorite. Under the bright lights, Cameron led Diana into the living room. Veronica's on a business trip for a couple days, he said. I already explained to her, your emotional state's a mess after the miscarriage. And you needed someone. Stay here for a few days. She'll understand. Cameron helped Diana onto the sofa and poured her a glass of water. She didn't take it. Instead, her hand slid smoothly around his neck. I always thought all these years, you were just using her as my stand-in. I paused mid-crunch, chips halfway to my teeth. Diana, that's all in the past. I love Veronica now. He pulled out some pills. Take your medicine and get some rest. But Diana suddenly perched herself on Cameron's lap. Cameron, you're doing this on purpose, aren't you? You really expect me to believe you haven't thought about me after all these years? Then why are you here with me right now, instead of with her? Diana. Cameron's voice was hoarse. He reached out to steady her waist, worried she might fall. Don't do this, he whispered. I had to give credit to the surveillance system I'd installed back then. The audio was exceptional, crystal clear. I glanced around my new place. I should install a similar system here too, might come in handy. After all, security in the US isn't always great. Don't do what? Diana said, her voice low and breathy. Cameron, I like you, and I know you like me too. Why else would you go after her, a woman who looks exactly like me? Diana began taking off her top, her figure striking under the lights. Cameron finally lost all control. Their heavy breathing melted together. Live-action passion like this? Way more gripping than anything on adult sites. I glanced cautiously toward the door. My parents still weren't back. Figures. A man pretending to be virtuous never lasts more than 3 seconds. The two of them moved together feverishly. I thought they'd end up in the bedroom. But instead, they spun into the study, just as Cameron was about to lay Diana down on the desk. He suddenly froze, like someone had flipped a switch and turned him to stone. Diana's hands were still roaming over him, entangling, but Cameron abruptly pulled away. He stepped out of the study, into the bedroom, and flung open the closet doors. The built-in wardrobe stretched wall to wall, and the right side was now completely empty. Cameron stepped closer, reached in, and pulled out a piece of clothing, red. He threw it onto the bed, pulled out another, red again. He tossed it, one after another. Every piece he grabbed was red. It was as if he'd seen a ghost, but he couldn't stop pulling out clothes. In the end, he yanked every single item from the wardrobe and threw them all onto the bed. Veronica, what the hell did you do? On the footage, I watched him furiously loosen his tie. His face turned red with rage. The tie looked like it was choking the life out of him. He stormed into the living room, ignoring Diana clutching her chest and calling after him. Cameron, what's wrong with you? But Cameron went straight for the phone on the coffee table. At first, he used voice messages. Veronica, what's going on? Where are the books from the study? What happened to the clothes in the wardrobe? I thought you were on a business trip. Answer me. Apparently, realizing voice wasn't the best choice, he started typing. That must have been the exact moment when he sent those messages I'd read earlier. I got up and grabbed another bag of chips. Let me tell you, when watching drama unfold like this, nothing beats a bag of chips. Nothing. I opened the bag, sat back down, and pressed play again. Chapter 10. Veronica. There's really nothing going on between me and Diana. I admit we were together once, but that's all in the past. My heart belongs to you now. Cameron. Diana couldn't hold herself up anymore after hearing that. Are you sure it's all in the past? If it was, then why did you come pick me up the moment I returned to the country? Why did you post time flies? It's already the 9th year? When your friends asked if you still hadn't gotten over me, you replied with yeah. Cameron, look at the words you said. Can you tell which of them were ever real? Cameron sank onto the sofa like his legs had given out. He didn't respond, just stared ahead, as if he hadn't heard her at all. I saw him start dialing my number, but all he heard on the other end was, the number you are trying to reach is currently powered off. Diana, seeing that he remained silent, tactfully didn't push any further. She walked over behind the sofa, gently placing her delicate hand on his shoulder, leaning down to comfort him. What she got in return was Cameron's cold voice. You should go. I'll call a ride to take you back to the hotel. Diana froze. Cameron, do you even know what time it is? It's 2 in the morning, and you want me to leave? Cameron brushed her hand off and stood up. He tapped quickly on his phone. The car's on its way. You have plenty of classmates in this city. Call one of them instead. Cameron, I just had a miscarriage. My body's still weak. Sure, I have other friends in the country, but you're the only one I trust. This trip back wasn't just for family, it was because I wanted a fresh start with you. Ever since I saw that post you made, with a photo of Veronica, I knew you hadn't let go of me. You need to be honest with yourself. We shouldn't keep missing each other like this. Diana. Cameron suddenly deflated, like a balloon losing air. Please leave. I can't lose Veronica. Yes, she looks like you, but she's not you, and you're not her. Her eyes don't carry that broken fragility. Her gaze is steady, and I suddenly realized, I'm tired of your weakness and your constant shattering. I don't want to lose Veronica. Diana didn't move at first, but seeing Cameron's face, completely cold and distant, she finally gave in, crying quietly. She rolled her suitcase toward the door and left. Cameron shut the door behind her. After scanning the room, he finally walked over to the bookshelf. He picked up the only thing I had left behind in that house, the framed photo of us together. Then he sat down on the sofa and spent the night there, alone, watching him like that, hunched and empty. I couldn't help but crack open another bottle of Coke. I've got to say, no matter what kind of drama you're watching, besides chips, there's one more essential item you must have. Popcorn. Too bad my US villa didn't come with any. So instead, I tore open another bag of chips. After all, the show wasn't over yet. Chapter 11. Cameron sat on the sofa all night, It wasn't until the next morning, when his secretary called, that he finally stood up and left the house. By the time he returned, it was already evening. Still wearing his suit, he sank right back into the sofa, out of habit. He sent me another voice message. I went to your company today. I told them if they didn't tell me where you went, I'd terminate all our business partnerships. That's how I found out you weren't on a business trip. You resigned, but no one would tell me where you went. Veronica, I'm guessing you just went off to clear your head. When are you coming back? Just reply to me, okay? Even if it's just one word, just let me know you're still there. Don't be mad anymore. Please, I'm begging you. Veronica, I'm really worried about you. Back then, when you said you had a fever, I should have taken you to the hospital. That was my fault. But Diana told me she had just gone through a breakup and a miscarriage. She said she didn't know who else to turn to, only me. I felt bad and went to take care of her, but I only did it because I was sure you'd be okay. Can you forgive me? My hand froze halfway to my mouth, chipped in midair. Whether I forgave him or not was no longer the point. The real question was, would the child I lost forgive me? Or rather, would that child forgive the father, who chose to comfort another woman who had miscarried, while abandoning his own? You, Cameron, are you even worthy of that forgiveness? Cameron remained on the sofa, eyes glued to his phone. Every time there was a sound, he picked it up immediately. There were countless messages, some from work, many from Diana, but to Cameron, they all just felt like noise. Frustrated, he flipped the phone face down on the coffee table. He stood up and walked toward the kitchen. He stood there for a while. Then, maybe feeling a bit hungry, opened the fridge. Chapter 12. When Cameron opened the fridge, his expression shifted instantly. He hesitated for a second, then slowly reached in and pulled out what he saw inside. A sea blue cake, with waves of white frosting carefully piped on top. The cake wasn't fresh anymore, but he recognized it immediately, a symbol of a promise he had once made with Veronica. It was a big promise, one they had even sketched out together on paper, a drawing he had carefully framed and placed in his office. He often imagined having a child with Veronica, a child with her steady gaze and decisive actions. Just like her, no nonsense, no hesitation. Then his mind drifted to Diana, the woman who looked exactly like Veronica. The day he first met Veronica, he nearly cried. She looked so much like his goddess, Diana. He and Diana had made a pact, a 10-year promise. If she wasn't married in 10 years, he would marry her. But Diana had gone overseas. They hadn't even stayed in touch. And it was Veronica who got him through all those long, aching nights of missing Diana. He had Veronica wear red dresses, just like the ones Diana used to love. He asked her to tie her hair the way Diana always did. Back then, Veronica looked so much like Diana. But over time, Cameron began to realize, Veronica was Veronica. She wasn't fragile like Diana. She didn't cave easily. She didn't crumble, give up her family, and run off overseas after a breakup. When the pandemic hit, Cameron stopped caring about how Veronica dressed or styled her hair. Those years, she often lounged at home with her hair loose, wearing her gray teddy bear pajamas. And in those quiet days, he saw something behind her steadiness, a kind of trust, a quiet reliance that was meant only for him. That was when he first started truly longing for a child with Veronica. He wanted to build a family, to walk the next chapter of life together. On their 9th anniversary, he had actually planned to propose. But that's when Diana called. She said she'd just gone through a breakup, had a miscarriage, and didn't want to live anymore. Cameron, maybe you're the only one who can save me. He didn't want to tell Veronica that Diana was his ex. He was afraid Veronica would be upset. But he also couldn't bear the thought of Diana actually dying. So he lied, said work was overwhelming, and set aside the proposal. For those few days at the hotel, he'd booked a room with 2 beds. He slept in the bed next to Diana. Every night, she'd wake up crying, threatening to end her life, and he simply didn't have the heart to walk away. Eventually, he realized that avoiding Veronica wasn't a solution, so he brought Diana home. He figured that if she was under his roof, under his watch, maybe her emotions wouldn't spiral again. What he didn't expect was that by the time he came home, Veronica was already gone. And this time, he knew it wasn't just a temporary disappearance. It was a permanent departure. He panicked. He admitted to himself he had come so close to crossing the line with Diana. But when he looked around at the empty study, at the half-empty wardrobe filled with shades of black and gray, that was when he truly woke up. He was on the verge of losing the most important thing in his life. It was the mark of love, 9 years carved deep into the layers of his life. Cameron knew it hadn't been pure from the start. But over time, that flawed gemstone of love had been polished by years, until it shone with undeniable brilliance. He had pushed Diana away, but it felt like he was falling, deeper and deeper into a void. He sent Veronica countless voice messages, countless texts, called her over and over. Veronica hadn't blocked him, not on any platform, and that was far more terrifying than being blocked. It meant she didn't care anymore. She didn't care whether he ended up with Diana. Didn't care if he got down on his knees to beg her to stay. Didn't care if he even remembered who Veronica was. She had given up. Cameron couldn't understand it. He sat in the house for several sleepless nights in a row, watching the sky grow light, then dark again, then light once more. Between light and shadow, he kept asking himself, all I did was spend a few days with Diana, and Veronica gave up on me like this? And as he thought about it again, his stomach growled. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten in days. His body was screaming for food. If not, it would collapse. And he didn't want to die. Not yet. He wanted, desperately, to say one last thing to Veronica. Even if it was just a single word. Even if that word was leave. Even screw off. Anything would still mean there was hope. Cameron opened the fridge. And then he saw it. That sea blue cake. If we ever have a child, let's make a cake the moment we find out. Okay? Cameron, what about a sea blue cake? Veronica had said. She was so talented, she'd sketched a rough design on a 7-inch card in minutes. Looks amazing, Veronica. And on the blue cake, we'll layer white cream into ocean waves. What do you think? Perfect, Veronica had replied, sketching more lines on the card. Our child should be like the ocean, born free, living vast, with a life full of possibilities, she said, eyes sparkling with hope. That night, they had stayed in each other's arms until sunrise. They dreamed together of a new life to come. That night, he began planning the proposal. And now, without him, without his involvement, that same sea blue cake was just sitting quietly in the fridge. Cameron took it out with trembling hands. His whole body was shaking. He started sending messages to Veronica again. Tell me, Veronica, our child is still here, right? Please, Veronica, even if you just tell me to screw off. It's better than this silence. He sent message after message. All of them vanished into the void. Cameron knew, deep down, with Veronica's character, if she had lost the baby, she wouldn't say a word. She would just leave. He thought back to that rainy night, when Veronica had begged him to take her to the hospital while she burned with fever. He thought of that quiet afternoon when she'd messaged him, asking to talk, and thinking, he suddenly slapped himself, hard. Then again, a thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He wiped the blood from his mouth. It didn't hurt, but soon after, a feverish wave surged through his body. His teeth began chattering uncontrollably. He stared at the sea blue cake, but he felt no freedom in its color, no vastness like the ocean. All he felt was that he had become an executioner, a murderer, and the victim was a child. The child he and Veronica had both once longed for, their shared dream for the future. The man once called President Cameron by everyone, now sat by the dining table like a broken old man. He stared blankly at the cake, his expression hollow, his body like withered driftwood rotting in silence. Then suddenly, he noticed a piece of paper beneath the cake. He reached out with trembling fingers and slowly pulled it free. It was a note written in Veronica's elegant handwriting. No matter what, Cameron, when you see this cake, please light a candle for our child. The child was gone, and just like that, Cameron broke again. Tears poured down, uncontrolled. He tried to wipe them, but the more he wiped, the more they slipped through his fingers like water. He tried to grit his teeth, tried to stop himself from sobbing aloud. But the more he held it in, the more it built up, until he couldn't take it anymore. He wept loudly, but the house was empty. There would be no more Veronica to hold him again. Once, when he was struggling in his career, it was Veronica who had held him through sleepless nights. Later on, she gave wings to his success. And even later, on the night when he reached a new peak in his career and burst into tears of joy, it was Veronica who embraced him first, telling him he was the most perfect man in the world. He had felt proud that in her eyes, he was flawless, but he had ruined it all. He, Cameron, had destroyed everything. His crying gradually weakened. The cake on the table sat cold, mocking him, a cruel reminder of his foolishness and hypocrisy. He grabbed a lighter and lit a single candle. He placed it on the cake, and when the flame burned out completely, he reached out and began stuffing the cake into his mouth. Fistful after fistful, the cake was no longer fresh. The cream tasted like wax, nauseating, but he kept shoving it in, handful by handful. By the time he was nearly finished, his stomach churned violently, and suddenly, he vomited it all up. Then, a hot rush surged from his throat, and he collapsed. Chapter 13. Veronica had actually turned off the video the moment she saw Cameron lose control and devour the cake. When she saw him light a candle for their lost child, any remaining interest she had in him disappeared completely. His tears, the blood at the corners of his mouth, and the swelling on his face from punching himself, Veronica saw all of it as something he deserved. She closed the video, shut off the now useless phone, and tossed it back into the drawer. Then she went to the master bedroom for a nap. She didn't believe that a man like Cameron would truly take responsibility for his actions. He was young, rich, and undeniably attractive. A few days of breakdown and mourning were, at best, just his way of making himself feel better. Give him a few more days of drinking, and he'd be back to bringing different women home. Maybe, given Cameron's obsession with substitute love, that genre where someone falls in love with a lookalike of their lost lover, he'd go find someone who resembled her again. And with that, Veronica drifted off to sleep. When she woke up, she began to write. The brand new environment in the United States unexpectedly gave her fresh inspiration. With a single keystroke, her thoughts began to flow like a spring. A sensation known as flow state hit her like lightning. Meanwhile, Cameron was lying in a hospital. Even he couldn't believe that he had vomited blood from heartbreak. It reminded him of that scene in The Great Way where Ding Yuanying spits blood after Rui Xiaodan dies. Turns out, it is possible to cough up blood from extreme emotional pain. Then he thought of Veronica. Had she really gotten rid of the baby? Was there a chance, however small, that she had softened and decided to keep it? Clinging to this obsession, Cameron began a desperate search for Veronica after being discharged from the hospital. But what he never expected was that Veronica's parents had blocked him on every platform. And the house was empty. Maybe Veronica had planned to vanish for good all along. None of the neighbors knew where the couple had gone. As for her other relatives, he had no contact information. The person most likely to know Veronica's whereabouts, Anna, had already left for Northern Europe. She had deleted all his contact info even earlier than Veronica. As for everyone else, the only lead he had was Veronica's former company. But no matter how persistently he pestered them, the staff there only repeated that Veronica had quit to take a break. Beyond that, they genuinely knew nothing, because Cameron kept causing scenes at related companies. The shareholders saw him as a liability to the company's image and removed him from his position as executive director. His fame and income plummeted. Many of his connections were instantly cut off. Even the group of people who used to suck up to him daily vanished without a trace. But Cameron didn't care. He handed over a large sum of money to several so-called detective agencies and begged them to find Veronica. But in the end, they all came back with the same answer. Veronica was no longer in the country. But which country had she gone to? Cameron was like a madman. If he wasn't out chasing leads about Veronica, he was on his way to another bar. Diana, on the other hand, was surprisingly persistent. She came to see him every single day. She even suggested, "Since you once chose her because she looked like me, why can't you just treat me as her now?" Cameron snapped back with disgust, "You're sick." But in truth, the one who was truly sickening from beginning to end was Cameron himself. His beard grew wild and unkempt. And eventually, he sold the apartment he had once shared with Veronica. He moved into a small, modest apartment. He couldn't bear to live in a place that constantly reminded him of everything he had destroyed. His Veronica, the Veronica he had once planned to propose to, and the child he had long dreamed of. That child who would have inherited Veronica's determination. All of it, gone. Eventually, he got a lead. Someone said Veronica was in the United States. At first, he didn't believe it. Veronica had once said, "While my parents are still alive, I will never go far." She had insisted she would never move abroad. But then Cameron saw a book published under Veronica's name, and he finally understood why he had never been able to find her. Veronica had entered a classified industry. For the sake of her career, she had severed all her social media ties. It was part of a corporate confidentiality agreement. Had she not published that book in the U.S., his chances of finding her would have remained virtually zero. And by that point, it had already been 10 full years since he lost Veronica. He finally saw her again, but only on the cover of her book. Time had only enhanced Veronica's beauty. Her eyes were even more resolute than before. At that moment, Cameron's heart surged with emotion. He took a long, cleansing shower in his apartment, then went to a barber to get a clean shave. His figure had remained in great shape. He walked in as a scruffy 40-something man and walked out looking like his younger, wealthier self from a decade ago. That flawless appearance really was a gift from the heavens to Cameron. So many years wasted. As even his friends had bluntly told him. In truth, Cameron didn't understand himself either. Why, after Veronica left, his heart had become so relentlessly fixated on her. In this lifetime, all of his obsessions had boiled down to one thing: seeing Veronica one more time, telling her he still loved her, admitting he had been wrong, and openly confessing the love he had never truly let go of. On the flight to America, he read Veronica's book again, cover to cover, and he caught one crucial detail: Veronica was unmarried. Maybe, just maybe, after all these years, she had raised the child and waited for him all along. With his heart pounding, Cameron drove a rented car straight to the address where Veronica now lived. Chapter 14. He knocked on the door, but it was a white woman who answered. Cameron asked her in English about Veronica, and the woman replied, "Today's Veronica's wedding day. It's happening at Chapel No. 3. I'm just here to pick up the rings for the groom." He's so nervous his mind's gone blank, he actually forgot to bring them. "If you don't know how to get there, you can come with me." The woman quickly shut the villa door, and together they crossed a green lawn toward the main road. People were stepping out of other nearby villas as well. "They're all headed to Vero's wedding," she said with a bright smile. Walking briskly, Cameron followed, his steps unsteady, his body swaying slightly. When they reached the entrance of the chapel, he hesitated. His feet wouldn't move forward. "You look even more nervous than the groom," the woman joked cheerfully, gesturing for him to go in. "You must be one of Vero's friends. You should be happy for her. She and the groom have been together for 9 years. As you Chinese people like to say, the number 9 means forever, right?" The woman pushed open the chapel door, and Cameron stood motionless outside. From Veronica's perspective inside the chapel, she first saw her white friend entering. Then she noticed a vaguely familiar figure lingering by the entrance. She didn't think much of it. Her eyes were fixed on her husband, Jack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer. As he confidently made his way through the crowd to retrieve the rings from his friend, Veronica's smile overflowed with joy. This man had waited for her for 9 years. Just because she had insisted on one thing, she had wanted to wait until The Year War-Torn World was published before getting married. And Jack had agreed. He said, "That's so romantic. 9 means forever. Honey, the Chinese language really is profound." Jack had been nervous the entire morning. Veronica found it utterly adorable. As Jack returned to the altar, Veronica noticed the man at the chapel entrance finally stepping out of the light and into the room. She recognized who it was. Cameron. Veronica figured he must be in town as a tourist, and had stumbled into her wedding by coincidence. Since he was a fellow Chinese, she offered him a polite smile. Then she turned back to prepare for the wedding to begin. That polite smile pierced Cameron like a dagger. This entire journey, everything had been for Veronica. Every strand of hair he'd carefully trimmed, every inch of skin he had washed and groomed, every second he had agonized over which outfit to wear, Every up and down emotion he felt as he boarded the flight, all of it had revolved around Veronica. What he never imagined was that Veronica had started a new relationship the very first year after leaving him. There had never been lingering affection. There had never been a child. He, Cameron, was nothing more than an aging man still stuck in the past. But Veronica, like her eyes, had always looked forward, resolutely living her life on her own terms. As the wedding march echoed through the chapel, Cameron stood helplessly watching Veronica and the handsome man beside her exchange vows. Priest, groom, do you take this woman to be your wife? Groom, yes, I do. Priest, will you love her for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, and remain by her side forever? Groom, yes, I will. The priest turned to Veronica. Priest, bride, do you take this man to be your husband? Bride, yes, I do. Priest, will you love him for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, and remain by his side forever? Bride, yes, I will. Priest, then by the power vested in me, in the name of the Holy Spirit, the Father, and the Son, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Groom, you may now kiss the bride. No one noticed that, as the happy couple kissed, a man named Cameron quietly walked out of the chapel. He walked aimlessly, hopelessly, until his eyes caught sight of a sky-blue sea. The white waves crashed onto the shore, like memories he had guarded with relentless devotion. He took off his shoes and began walking, step by step, deeper into the water. Veronica, I'm going to see our son now. I know this is the consequence of my own choices, but I will never wish you happiness, because all the love I had ended with you. 3 days later, in a place called Massachusetts, a man's body was found near the shallows. But the newlywed Veronica had no idea. After all, the sea had carried that body far, far away from her. More importantly, she was now immersed in her new happiness. She had long let go of the past and was cherishing the present, because only the present is eternal. Story 2. Married to Diego for 50 years, I served his parents, managed the household, and raised our children. He praised me to everyone, speaking of how wonderful I was. Yet, on his deathbed, after sending our children away, his gaze toward me was no longer gentle. His eyes were full of resentment and bitterness. Bianca, the biggest mistake of my life was marrying you. I regret it. I hate it. I was shocked, unable to understand. After he drew his last breath, I found the answer in the palm of his tightly clenched hand. It turned out that Diego and his childhood sweetheart had made a 7-year vow, a promise to marry if neither of them wed another during that time. When I opened my eyes again, I had clarity. Diego, let's part ways and leave each other in peace. Chapter 1. Bianca, why are you off work so early today? I just saw Diego come back. He looked so radiant, clearly something good happened. Could it be that your marriage application was approved? Are we going to have a wedding banquet soon? Just as I was about to open the gate to the yard, Sandra, my neighbor who was sorting vegetables, spotted me. Faced with her inquisitive gaze, I mentally calculated the timeline. Diego's friend just returned from overseas. Sandra looked a little disappointed at the lack of wedding news. So, are you and Diego getting married before the end of the year? We're all waiting. In my previous life, I was supposed to marry Diego in just 2 weeks. But now, I clutched the marriage application tucked in my pocket. Half an hour ago, I realized I had been reborn. The first thing I did was head to the office and retrieve the marriage application for Diego and me. After handling Sandra's questions, I pushed open the gate to the yard. Diego was standing just inside. We came face to face unexpectedly. He was dressed in his neatly pressed work uniform, which accentuated his broad shoulders, slim waist, and long legs. He looked exactly as I remembered. His deep, piercing eyes gazed at me with confidence, composure, and a hint of coldness. It had taken me a lifetime to understand that the coldness in his eyes wasn't a personality trait, it stemmed from his dislike for me. How did you know I had a friend returning from overseas? Diego asked. His brows furrowed as he studied me. It seemed he had overheard my conversation with Sandra. Meeting his gaze, I calmly replied, "Didn't you mention it?" Diego's suspicion deepened. When did I say that? In my previous life, Diego's childhood sweetheart, Rita, returned on this exact day. He had kept it a secret from me until an accident forced him to introduce her. You don't remember? I answered. If you didn't say it, how would I know? Diego stayed silent, scrutinizing me as though I were a spy. Seeing how composed and indifferent I was, he began to doubt himself. Maybe he had mentioned it without realizing. Clearing his throat, he said, "Right. I was going to tell you. A friend of mine just returned from overseas and doesn't have a place to stay. I was about to help her find somewhere, so I won't be back for dinner tonight. I hadn't planned on cooking for him anyway." "All right. Go ahead," I replied with a nod. Diego was momentarily startled by my quick agreement. I knew what he was thinking. Diego was a handsome man and, after leaving the military, had become a high school math teacher, a coveted bachelor in many women's eyes. Naturally, I used to keep a tight watch on him. Whenever he went out, I'd ask where he was going, who he was meeting, and I'd dig into the person's background. Over time, it annoyed him. He started sneaking out whenever I wasn't home. Today, he had planned to do the same, but he hadn't expected me to return early. "Why are you staring at me? Hurry up and go. Don't keep your friend waiting." Now, not only was I not questioning him, but I was urging him to leave. The sooner he left, the sooner I could handle my own business. "Here, this is some chocolate." Diego hesitated before pulling a piece of chocolate out of his pocket. In my previous life, this never happened. I glanced at the chocolate in his hand. It wasn't hard to guess. He probably intended to give it to Rita. For some reason, though, he was offering it to me now. "I don't eat this kind of thing. It'll rot my teeth." I declined. I was no longer the naive girl who'd swoon at a small gesture of kindness from him. Nor would I forget the words he spoke to me on his deathbed. "Bianca, the biggest mistake of my life was marrying you. I regret it. I hate it." Seeing my rejection, Diego tried to explain. "This isn't candy. It's chocolate. I wouldn't know the difference. You should give it to someone who does." I cut him off impatiently and walked past him into the house. This time, let him and his childhood sweetheart be tied together for good. Chapter 2. That night, Diego didn't come home. I didn't waste my time guessing what he and his childhood sweetheart, Rita, might be doing. Instead, I stayed up all night writing a report to apply for employee housing. Early the next morning, I submitted the application. The result wouldn't be out for a few days. Returning to work, I immersed myself in my duties. Time passed quietly, and before I knew it, the morning was almost over. I only had 2 or 3 patients left when Diego, carrying Rita in his arms, rushed in with hurried steps and pushed to the front of the line. "Bianca, please take a look at my friend. She hurt her leg. Can you stop the bleeding first?" I glanced at him briefly. I hadn't expected Diego, who had always been strict about rules and putting others first, to cut in line. Diego looked anxious. "Why are you looking at me? Hurry up and check her leg." Following Diego's words, I looked at Rita's exposed calf. A shallow scratch. If they'd come any later, it would have started scabbing. I said calmly, "Go to the back of the line." Diego was stunned. "What?" I raised my voice. I said, "Go to the back of the line." This time, Diego heard me clearly. His brows furrowed, and his tone dropped. "Bianca." I ignored him and continued tending to the patient in front of me. Diego hadn't expected me to treat him so coldly. He reached out and tugged at my arm. I turned to him sharply. "Diego, you're a teacher. Don't tell me you don't understand the concept of first come, first served? Or is this how you teach your students at school?" Diego was completely taken aback by my words. Sensing the tension, Rita intervened. "Diego, I'm fine. Let's go to the back of the line." Hearing Rita's words, Diego finally moved, helping her to the end of the queue. When it was finally Rita's turn, I took out some iodine and dabbed it on her wound to disinfect it. "All right. Just make sure to keep it dry." Diego looked incredulous. "That's it? What else? Doesn't it need to be bandaged?" I glanced at Rita's wound again. Sure enough, it had already scabbed over. Memories from my previous life resurfaced unbidden. I was 35 years old, and after dropping my son off at school, I stopped by the market to buy groceries. A speeding motorcycle grazed my leg, leaving a 7-centimeter long gash that bled profusely. When I left the hospital, my leg was wrapped in layers of gauze, looking like a giant rice dumpling. That evening, when Diego came home from work and saw the state of my leg, he listened to what had happened and showed no concern. Instead, he scoffed at me, calling me delicate. That little scratch? You're so fragile. Back in my day, my comrades and I got shot, and no one needed bandages like this. You're just making a fuss over nothing. Going to the hospital was a waste of money. A bit of alcohol at home would have been enough. Back then, I thought he was just a typical macho man, lacking empathy. Now I see it differently. It wasn't that he didn't understand how to care. I just wasn't the person he cared for. Sure, it needs bandaging. Go ahead, Diego. You can do it yourself. I'm off duty now and heading to lunch. I placed the basket of gauze on the table, ignoring Diego's dark expression. I picked up my lunchbox and left. Bianca, is that woman Diego was carrying your cousin? Just as I finished getting my food, Lisa from my department came over to gossip. Cousin, such a familiar term. In my previous life, Diego had taken great care of Rita but feared rumors. So, he gave her an identity. He told everyone that Rita was my cousin. With that label, no one thought twice about the future brother-in-law taking care of his cousin. Back then, I had been naive enough to believe their relationship was as pure as siblings. Naturally, I accepted the cousin narrative without question. Lisa, you're so considerate. You even pay attention to your cousin's affairs. Diego's so lucky to have you. Lisa teased. She's not my cousin. She's just a friend Diego brought back from overseas. She doesn't have any family here. I corrected her with a calm smile. Chapter 3. Aw. Lisa's jaw dropped so far she could have fit an egg in her mouth. It took her a while to process the information. And then she stammered. So Diego is really kind to his friends. Although this wasn't an era of strict feudal customs anymore, there were still unwritten rules about men and women, especially for a man like Diego, who was already engaged, to carry an unrelated woman into his fiancé's workplace. Even a dog would overthink it. Lisa walked away, and as I turned around, I saw Diego standing behind me, his face cold. Once we were alone, he finally spoke. Bianca, I didn't mention this before, but my family and Rita's are old family friends. We grew up together until she was 18, when her family had to move abroad due to certain circumstances. She hasn't had it easy these past few years. Her parents both passed away, and now that she's back, she has no one else. He had said the same thing in my previous life. Back then, he painted Rita as a helpless girl with no family, evoking my sympathy so I would accept her as my cousin. I looked at him. So, what does that have to do with you telling people she's my cousin? Diego froze for a moment. In his eyes, I'd never had many good qualities, but there was one thing he did value: my kindness. I was empathetic, especially toward girls like me who had no family. I've always thought of Rita as a little sister. He explained. Now that she's back, I feel responsible for looking after her in place of her parents. But as a man, I worry that people might gossip and tarnish her reputation. So, Bianca, could you? No, I cut him off. I don't have a habit of adopting sisters. If you really think of her as a sister, then hold a proper banquet. Invite everyone over and announce it openly. If everyone knows she's your sister, then surely no one would dare to gossip. It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion, but Diego fell silent. After all, to him, Rita wasn't just a sister, she was a special sister. Despite my refusal, Diego went ahead and spread the word that Rita was my cousin, just as he had in my previous life. It didn't take long before Diego brought her into the house. He said, "The guest house Rita was staying at isn't very safe lately. I'm worried something might happen. So I asked her to stay at home for a couple of days." Rita looked at me with her big, sparkling eyes. "Bianca, I'm really sorry to trouble you like this. I was in the kitchen, whisking eggs, and didn't even look up." "Oh, this is your house. You can bring whoever you want to stay here." That's right, I was living in Diego's house. The house I inherited from my parents had been destroyed in last year's floods. But I wasn't living in Diego's house for free. I paid rent every month, cleaned the entire house, and even covered the grocery bills. Back then, I thought Diego and I would eventually marry, so I never bothered calculating who gained or lost in the arrangement. Seeing me agree so easily, Diego gave me a strange look, but he was satisfied with the outcome. With a small nod, he added, "Are you cooking? Make a bit more. Rita will be eating at home from now on too." I didn't respond, thinking I had agreed. Diego took Rita to set up her room but made a point to remind me, "Oh, and Rita doesn't eat onions, so don't put any in the food." I still didn't reply. "Diego, I think Bianca seemed upset earlier. Maybe I should just go back to the guest house," Rita whispered. The house wasn't that big, and no matter how softly they spoke, I could still hear them. Diego looked at her and said, "Bianca was born with a sour face. Don't let it bother you. Just settle in comfortably. I heard you two already submitted a marriage application. I'd feel terrible if my presence caused problems between you two." At this, Diego seemed to remember the marriage application. In truth, the application hadn't been his idea. It had happened during a meal with his colleagues. When his superiors learned about us, they nudged him, saying it was time for him to settle down and get married. I guessed that back then, Diego had assumed he'd never see Rita again. Feeling resigned, he filed the application, and then, just days later, Rita came back. He was probably kicking himself with regret now. "It won't," Diego finally said after a long pause. I carried my bowl of egg noodles back to my room, but as I passed by their door, I caught a glimpse through the crack. At some point, Diego had bought a jar of snowflake cream in front of Rita. He unscrewed the lid with an eager expression, with a face full of warmth and flattery. He said, "I heard women like this kind of thing, so I bought it for you. See if you like it." Chapter 4. Snowflake Cream. I couldn't help but recall how it had become a nightmare in my previous life. After a few years, Diego was promoted from teacher to grade director, and his salary wasn't small, but he was always generous, often lending money to colleagues in need. Over time, the amount of money he brought home dwindled. Sometimes, he even asked me to use my savings to help others, to take care of his parents and raise our children. I had to stretch every penny as far as it could go. In the monotony of those days, I gradually lost sight of myself. One night, Diego came home drunk. After helping him wash up and dragging him to bed, he cupped my face and stared at me for a long time. I blushed, thinking he was enchanted by me, but when he spoke, his words were cold and cutting. "Bianca, why does your face look older than my mom's? Dark and rough." I froze on the spot. "Can't you learn from other women and use some snowflake cream or something on your face?" With that, he closed his eyes and passed out. The next morning, I didn't even bother going to the market for groceries. Instead, I went looking for snowflake cream, but I couldn't afford it. A single jar cost as much as a month's worth of groceries for the entire family. Years later, when I could finally afford it, I was already old. Diego stared at me in the mirror for a long time and said, "What's the point of slathering all that stuff on your face? Do you think it'll make you younger? Looking all gaudy like that, don't corrupt the grandkids." And then he turned and walked away. "Thanks, but I usually don't use this kind of thing. I prefer imported brands," Rita said, glancing at the jar with mild disdain. "You should give it to Bianca. She might like it." Sitting in my room eating noodles, I heard Diego push open the door, the snowflake cream in hand. He frowned. "Why are you eating by yourself?" Without looking up, I replied, "Because I am. What's your problem? Didn't I tell you?" I swallowed the last bite of noodles and looked at him. "You told me, but I didn't agree. Besides, there's only enough in the kitchen for one person. If you want to eat, go buy your own groceries and cook your own meal." "Bianca, what are you trying to say?" Diego's brows furrowed even deeper. "It's simple. I'm not your maid. I'm not responsible for your meals or anything else." Diego's expression flickered with shock. "What do you mean? Your house and my house. Once the marriage application is approved, we'll be husband and wife. There's no need to draw such clear lines between us." I stood up and looked at him calmly. "Diego, do you truly want to marry me?" Diego rarely showed any signs of guilt in front of me, but this time, he avoided my gaze. giving a vague response. Well, I'm not going to back out. Yes. He wouldn't back out. He'd marry me, then resent me for the rest of his life. I see Rita as a little sister, and I hope you can too. This is a gift from her for you. Diego didn't dare meet my eyes. He set the jar of snowflake cream down on the table and quickly left the room. I glanced at the snowflake cream on the table and placed it in a drawer. It just so happened to rest on top of the marriage application form. In this life, neither snowflake cream nor Diego would hold me back anymore. Chapter 5. Diego left the house, and then came back. Through the door, I heard bits and pieces of his conversation. It turned out he had gone to borrow some eggs from Sandra next door. Diego had never stepped foot in the kitchen before. But for Rita, he spent half the day tinkering away in there. He even managed to fry some eggs with a bit of flair for her. I couldn't tell how they tasted, but Rita's giggles said enough. As they ate, the two reminisced about their childhood. When they reached the year they both turned 18 and faced the upheaval that forced their separation. Rita's voice choked with emotion. Diego, do you remember the promise we made back then? Diego didn't say he remembered, nor did he say he didn't. He simply hummed in response, and then, they both fell silent, lying in bed. I couldn't help but drift into memories of my past life. The promise between Diego and Rita that if neither married anyone else, they would wed each other after 7 years was something I only discovered after Diego's death. It was written on a small, yellowed piece of paper, clenched tightly in his hand. Holding that paper, my feelings couldn't be summed up as mere sorrow. Flashes of my life with Diego played in my mind like a reel. I met Diego the year he came home from the military. It was near the end of the year, and he returned carrying a simple bag over his shoulder, holding a slip of paper. He pushed open the gate to our courtyard and looked at me, asking for directions. Comrade, excuse me, would this be Angelo's house? I was drying persimmons and turned around to look at him. Thick eyebrows, sharp eyes, and a tall, sturdy build. I couldn't find the words to describe him. My mind was filled with just one thought. Handsome. So handsome. He was unbelievably handsome. Are you looking for Angelo? He lives next door. My father answered as he lifted the curtain to step outside. Diego nodded his thanks and turned to leave. My father called after him. What's your relationship to Angelo? I'm his son, Diego, he said, turning back briefly. After he left, my father noticed I was still frozen in place and called my name. Girl, still staring? He's already gone. My face flushed with embarrassment as I ran back into the house amidst my father's laughter. That ordinary morning, when Diego pushed open the gate, he also pushed open my heart. I became Diego's fiancée the following summer. Diego's father had been bitten by a venomous snake while working in the fields. Although he was rushed to the clinic, there was no anti-venom available for immediate treatment. Diego, who was in the middle of teaching, was called back home immediately. He knelt by his father's bedside, listening as the man delivered his final wishes. The greatest regret in his father's life was that he wouldn't live to see Diego get married and have children. Dad, I already have someone in my heart, Diego said suddenly, lifting his head. In stunned silence, Diego declared, Dad, I have feelings for Bianca. I want to marry her. The next second, everyone's eyes turned toward me. When Diego said he had someone in his heart, I felt a pang of disappointment. But when he revealed that person was me, my heart soared. In the span of 3 seconds, I experienced what it meant to rise from the dust to the clouds. Uncle, I like Diego too. I'm willing to marry him, I blurted out without hesitation. At that moment, I naively believed Diego truly cared for me. Thinking back now, he simply didn't want his father to die with regrets. I was just a tool for his filial piety. Later, the anti-venom was rushed in from a higher-level hospital, and Diego's father was saved. From then on, Diego never mentioned marriage again, always using work as an excuse to avoid the topic. Eventually, after my parents died in an accident, he couldn't back out of the engagement anymore. Diego, those were just the words of a child. Don't take them seriously, and don't dwell on them, came a voice from outside the room after a long pause. Hearing Rita's words, Diego stayed silent. Rita continued, Bianca, she's a good woman. It's obvious she likes you a lot. And you two seem well suited for each other. Her voice softened at the last sentence, as though even she didn't believe her own words. I yawned, closed my eyes, and drifted off to sleep. I never found out how Diego responded to Rita. The next morning, when I opened my door, I saw the two of them standing in the courtyard. The soft morning light bathed the entire yard. Rita was standing in front of Diego, tying his tie. Diego was tall, and to make it easier for Rita, he obediently lowered his head. The scene was both warm and picturesque. You look so handsome, Rita said with a satisfied smile after finishing the tie. Diego stretched his neck awkwardly. Do I? Of course. That's how people abroad wear it to work, Rita said with a raised brow. Wait, don't move. It looks a bit crooked. Diego froze, not daring to move a muscle. Rita adjusted the tie slightly. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and kissed him on the lips. Chapter 6. Rita's kiss caught Diego completely off guard. He instinctively took a step back, accidentally knocking over a flower pot that had been resting nearby. The clatter echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet courtyard. Bianca, Bianca, Rita quickly followed. Both of them turned toward the door in unison. When they saw me, Diego's expression cycled through a rainbow of emotions. He tried to compose himself, but it was clear he couldn't. Rita was the first to speak. Bianca, don't misunderstand. Just now. It's actually a kind of greeting custom from abroad. A kiss. And she still asked me not to misunderstand. Of course, she had just returned from abroad, and her psychological resilience was clearly stronger than most. I pressed my lips together and walked toward them. Maybe I was just born with a naturally stern face. My unsmiling demeanor made Rita's face pale. She bit her lip nervously. I pulled my hand out of my pocket. Seeing my movement, Diego instinctively yanked Rita behind him and looked at me. Bianca, if you have something to say it to me. Don't. He thought I was going to hit her. In truth, I was just pulling out a dead leaf that had gotten stuck in my pocket. I crumbled it between my fingers, letting the fragments scatter in the wind until they disappeared. Much like my feelings for Diego, I ignored Diego and glanced at Rita. Miss Rita, that's quite an interesting foreign custom. But Diego had a cold sore on his lip a couple of days ago. Medically speaking, it's a virus. Be careful not to catch it. Rita's pupils widened in shock. Without looking back, I walked away. Bianca, you're just in time. Your application for staff housing has been rejected, said the department head as soon as I arrived at the office. Why? I asked, puzzled. It's because you don't meet the requirements. That's how things were in this era. If you didn't meet the criteria, nothing could get done. Director, I was about to plead with him when someone barged in loudly, interrupting me. These young people today are so unwilling to endure hardship. No one wants to go. The director turned to the newcomer and asked, still no one willing to volunteer? That's right. On the surface, it looks like a tough assignment. But once you've been there and come back, things could change significantly. From the fragments of their conversation, combined with memories from my previous life, something clicked in my mind. I suddenly remembered that the clinic had been ordered by the higher-ups to assign a medical worker to the Northwest front lines. When people heard Northwest, especially during the winter, they knew it would be a grueling assignment. Everyone avoided it. And because I was preparing to marry Diego, I hadn't volunteered either. In the end, the task fell to a newcomer at the neighboring clinic. She went, stayed for 5 years, and returned with multiple promotions. By the time she retired, she was receiving the same benefits as the director, with several talented students under her mentorship. Later, my old colleagues deeply regretted not volunteering. If I had known, I would have gone no matter what, even if it killed me. Director, I'll go. I volunteer. I raised my hand excitedly. The director turned to me, astonished. The assignment was urgent and the workload heavy. After confirming my decision several times, the director granted me a half-day leave to pack my things and say goodbye to my family. I didn't have any relatives in town, but my neighbors were kind to me, so I went out immediately, bought groceries and meat, and invited Sandra and the others over for a meal. When Diego and Rita returned, I had just finished preparing the dishes. Why did you make so much food today? Diego asked, eyeing the table full of dishes with curiosity. Before I could answer, Sandra and the others pushed open the door, carrying festive-looking gifts in their hands. Bianca, look at what we've brought for you. I brushed past Diego to greet them. Sandra, sister-in-law, just having you here is enough. You didn't need to bring anything. How could we come empty-handed when you're hosting us for a meal? Girl, you seem so happy, treating us to a feast. Did your marriage application with Diego get approved? Hearing this, Diego's expression froze instantly. Bianca, the marriage application has been approved? Chapter 7. I glanced at Diego, then took a moment to glance at Rita beside him. Her once bright and lively face had gone pale. Sensing my gaze, Rita clutched her head and said, Diego, I have a headache. I think I'll go back to my room to rest. Diego looked at her, unsure how to comfort her. He could only nod. Okay. The people around us noticed their interaction, and the atmosphere cooled briefly. I said nothing and simply invited everyone to sit down. Soon, the lively chatter of eating and drinking filled the air again. Everyone assumed that Diego and I were about to get married, showering us with blessings. May you have many children, grow old together. All the things Diego didn't want to hear. Eventually, he found an excuse to call me outside, standing in the faint interplay of light and shadow. His features were partially obscured. Bianca, I need to know, has the marriage application really been approved? I stared at him and lied. It has, even though he should have expected this. Diego's eyes widened in disbelief. Maybe it had come sooner than he anticipated. I watched the discomfort spread across his face and pretended not to notice. The application has been approved, aren't you happy? Happy. Diego forced the word out through gritted teeth. Of course you're happy. After all, you were the one who told your father you wanted to marry me because you had feelings for me. I continued. Diego stiffened at the reminder of that moment. But, Diego, I'm not happy. Looking back at my life, the biggest mistake I ever made was marrying you. I returned his words from my previous life to him, word for word. Diego looked at me in shock, unable to understand. Bianca, what are you saying? I said it very clearly, and you heard it just as clearly. No, this can't be. Diego shook his head repeatedly. A flicker of doubt crossed his eyes, but then his expression cleared as if he'd figured it out. Looking at me, he said, I see now. You said that on purpose, didn't you? I didn't understand what he meant, taking my silence as agreement. Diego grew confident. I knew it. There's no way you'd regret marrying me. You're just jealous because Rita kissed me earlier, right? Enough, Bianca. Rita already explained, it was just a Western greeting custom. Don't hold on to it. I smiled silently. Diego seemed uneasy. I really do see Rita as a sister. You, Diego. His good sister appeared right on cue. Diego turned to see Rita standing there with a suitcase in her hand. He immediately walked over. Rita, what are you doing? Rita's eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. Seeing Diego, she forced a small smile. Diego, you and Bianca are getting married. It's not appropriate for me to stay here anymore. I should leave. It's so late. Where would you even go? Diego asked. Rita avoided his eyes. I have a friend. Diego didn't hesitate to expose her. Other than me. Who do you even know here? Rita pressed her lips together. Silent for a moment, she quickly glanced at me, then said, Diego, I wish you and Bianca a long and happy marriage, with many children. Resolutely, she shoved past Diego, grabbed her suitcase, and left without looking back. Rita! Diego called after her and ran out. As he passed me, a gust of wind followed in his wake. It felt just like my past life. On the day Diego and I were actually married, Rita had made a scene about moving out. Diego had left me, left all the guests at the banquet, and chased after her. But unlike last time, when he didn't even glance back, this time, he paused in front of me. Bianca, wait for me to come back, he said. Diego's figure disappeared into the twilight. I turned and went back inside. Sandra and the others had overheard most of what happened outside. Seeing me, they couldn't help but comment. Bianca, that cousin of yours doesn't seem easy to deal with. You should be careful. I took a bite of food and replied, She's not my cousin. She's Diego's childhood sweetheart. His little sister by affection, not by blood. What? They exchanged puzzled looks. After everyone had left, I took out the bag I had already packed and walked out of the house without looking back. Everything of mine was gone from the house. The only things left behind were the annulled marriage application and the jar of snowflake cream. Chapter 8. Diego caught up with Rita in the depths of the alley. Without saying a word, Rita threw herself into his arms and cried bitterly. When she had cried enough, Diego finally tried to persuade her. It's so late. You won't find a place to stay. Why don't you come back with me? No, I don't want to go back. Rita refused adamantly. Left with no choice, Diego took Rita to a guest house. Diego. I'm scared. Rita clung to him as he was about to leave. Can you stay with me? Diego turned around and met her tear-filled eyes. For some reason, Bianca's gaze from earlier that evening flashed through his mind. Cold, distant, and almost unfamiliar. He distinctly remembered that Bianca used to look at him differently. A wave of confusion washed over him, and he found himself blurting out, "No, I need to go back." Rita froze, surprised by his swift refusal. Biting her lip, she played coy. Is it because you want to go back to Bianca? Well, of course. She's your wife now. You should be with her. After all, I'm just your sister by affection, not blood. Hearing this, Diego hesitated. Rita gave him a gentle push. Diego, don't worry about me. Go back quickly. Don't keep Bianca waiting too long. That little push helped Diego make up his mind. You're right. It's not safe for you to stay here alone. Diego picked up an extra blanket from the room and placed it at the door. I'll sleep on the floor tonight. Rita had achieved her goal, but when she tried to take things further, she hit a wall. Diego held firm and refused to cross the line. He didn't touch her. The next morning, Diego took Rita out to find and rent a place. By the time everything was settled, it was already evening. Thinking of Bianca, he felt a pang of guilt. On the way home, he stopped at a convenience store to buy her favorite snacks. He figured Bianca must be at home cooking dinner by now. Pushing open the door, he began reciting the excuse he had prepared last night. I arranged for Rita to stay at the guest house, and I was about to come back. But then, halfway through his sentence, Diego stopped cold. The kitchen was empty. Bianca wasn't there. Frowning, he went to push open the door to her room. The room was spotless and devoid of anyone. His brow twitched uncontrollably. A bad feeling began to spread through Diego's chest. Diego stepped out of the house and searched every corner of the small, cramped space again. He went in and out of the courtyard twice. When he spotted Sandra next door, he couldn't help but ask, "Sandra, have you seen Bianca?" Normally, Sandra would greet Diego with a warm smile and enthusiasm. But today, it was as if she had seen something unpleasant. She replied curtly, "Haven't seen her," and quickly went back inside. Diego felt that something was off, but he didn't think too much about it. Finding Bianca was his priority. He went back into the house. This time, he finally noticed something on the table that had been there all along. He walked closer, and froze in place. On the table were the annulled marriage application and the unopened jar of snowflake cream. Diego's mind involuntarily replayed Bianca's words from the previous night. She had said, "Diego, I'm not happy. Looking back at my life, the biggest mistake I ever made was marrying you." It felt like a bolt of lightning struck him. His head buzzed, and he kept muttering to himself, This can't be. It can't be." It was hard to believe. After all, he vividly remembered the way Bianca had looked at him the first time they met. Her eyes sparkling with light. She had looked at him like he was a treasure, full of adoration. How could someone like that suddenly decide she wouldn't marry him anymore? Diego jumped on his bike and rushed to the administrative office. The result of his inquiry hit him like a ton of bricks. Bianca had taken back the marriage application over 10 days ago. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Diego panicked. He pedaled as fast as he could to the clinic. He needed to ask Bianca why she had done this. The head nurse, seeing Diego drenched in sweat, said, "Bianca's already gone to the Northwest front lines. Didn't you know that?" Diego shook his head. He looked as though he'd just been pulled out of a lake. Utterly drained, he pushed his bicycle, soaking wet, as he trudged back home. Chapter 9. Have you found Bianca? One by one, familiar faces passed by, all aware that Diego was looking for Bianca. Diego, pale and worn, shook his head. Seeing his state, no one seemed surprised. As Diego walked a little farther away, the bystanders started whispering, "TSK, TSK. Bianca is such a good woman, and he ruined it. Serves him right." "What do you mean by that? You don't know? That Rita woman Diego keeps introducing as Bianca's cousin isn't her cousin at all, she's his mistress." "What? A mistress? And he had the audacity to bring her home? That's outright bullying Bianca." "Exactly." Diego, returning from his search, overheard and immediately scolded. "What nonsense are you spouting?" The group hesitated briefly but quickly regained their confidence. "Diego, you know perfectly well if it's nonsense or not. You're engaged, but you're fooling around with another woman. Don't think we didn't see you and that Rita woman entering the guest house together and not coming out all night." Diego faltered. We're innocent." "Innocent? Spending the night at a guest house together? Who do you think you're fooling? Pa, you don't deserve someone like Bianca." The group spat on the ground near Diego before walking away. Diego stood frozen in place for a long time. It wasn't until days later that Diego began to realize Bianca was truly gone. He had never thought Bianca was particularly important to him. But now, every little thing seemed to remind him of her. When he saw someone harvesting persimmons, he would remember Bianca rolling up her sleeves and climbing trees. Sitting high on a branch, she would pick a ripe persimmon and shout down, "Diego, look, isn't this one perfectly red?" Diego would step closer and reply, "It's red." "Diego, what's red?" Rita's voice snapped him back to reality. Diego turned to see Rita standing beside him, looking puzzled. "Why are you here?" he asked. Rita smiled and held up a lunchbox. "I brought you lunch." Diego glanced at the box, frowning slightly. Rita, having spent years abroad, only knew how to prepare Western-style meals, cold bread, cold eggs, and a few pieces of lettuce. They were nothing like Bianca's steaming hot pork dumplings. "I've already eaten," Diego said hesitantly. "But..." Rita's voice wavered, feeling a bit hurt. At that moment, the school principal arrived, calling out, "Diego, come with me for a moment." About 10 minutes later, Diego emerged from the office, his expression grim. Rita, still waiting, immediately approached him. "Diego, what's wrong?" Diego shook his head without saying a word. Rita reached out to hold his arm, but Diego brushed her off. News of the meeting soon spread around the school. It turned out that a parent had reported Diego for inappropriate relationships with women, fearing he would be a bad influence on students. As a result, Diego was disqualified from being considered for the Outstanding Teacher Award he had been in line for. When Rita found out, she stormed into the principal's office to argue on Diego's behalf. By the time Diego arrived, the office was in chaos. "Diego, I only wanted to help you," Rita said, her voice trembling. "Brother." Rita thought Diego would comfort her, but instead, he scolded her harshly. "Ridiculous. Who told you to meddle in my affairs?" Rita was deeply aggrieved. "Brother, I was just trying to fight for your justice." "I don't need it." The next moment, Rita burst into tears. Outside, a crowd of teachers had gathered. Many of them had met Bianca before, and now, comparing her to Rita, they couldn't help but sigh. "So, this is the sister Diego brought back from abroad? She's nothing like Bianca. Poor Diego, his life's going to be tough from now on." Their murmurs didn't escape Diego's ears. He hadn't realized that the Bianca he once thought was plain and unremarkable was so highly regarded in everyone else's eyes. After Rita's outburst, Diego was reassigned from teaching math to becoming a PE teacher. With much more free time on his hands, Diego started reflecting. The more he thought, the more he realized how often Bianca filled his thoughts. He recalled their first meeting, Bianca, with her hair in 2 braids, wearing a red floral jacket, drying persimmons in the courtyard. When he opened the gate, it startled her. She turned to look at him, her deer-like eyes especially striking. As thoughts of Bianca consumed him, his feelings for Rita began to wane. Diego convinced himself that if he waited long enough, Bianca would return. and everything could be salvaged. But Rita sensed Diego's growing distance and didn't want to wait anymore. One evening, when Diego was drinking to drown his sorrows again, Rita climbed into his bed. The next morning, just as the neighbors were waking up but hadn't yet gone out, Rita staged a dramatic scene. She ran out of Diego's house in disheveled clothes, screaming about wanting to jump into the river. With this act, Diego's reputation was completely ruined. Left with no choice, Diego married Rita. Chapter 10. Far away on the Northwest front lines. I was completely unaware of all this, nor did I have the time to speculate about Diego and Rita's ultimate fate. As the new year approached, I performed a cesarean section on a mare struggling with a difficult birth. Among the group that came to express their appreciation afterward was a doctor. Hearing about the procedure, he offered me career-changing advice. "Young lady, your hands are remarkably steady. You're wasted as just a nurse, consider specializing in surgery," he said. "If the opportunity arises, I hope to see you at the Kyoto hospital someday." Before leaving, he handed me a few books. It felt like I had found my direction in life. I pored over those books, reading them repeatedly until I had memorized every word. In the days that followed, I became the go-to person for performing surgeries on cows, sheep, or any other livestock struggling with birth among the herders. Time passed day by day. I lived a life completely different from my previous one, understanding for the first time what it meant to live freely and for myself. I never thought about Diego again. 5 years went by in a flash. My mission there came to an end, and I returned to the long-awaited health clinic. The same director who had sent me off personally came to greet me. "Bianca, welcome back." He handed me a transfer letter. "This is from Kyoto Hospital. They specifically requested you." I opened the letter and immediately recognized the handwriting. There was no doubt about it. It was from Dr. Duncan, the mentor who had set me on this path 5 years ago. Over the years, I had kept in touch with him, writing letters whenever I encountered something I didn't understand. He always replied thoughtfully, despite his busy schedule. That evening, my colleagues held a welcome back and farewell party for me at the state-run restaurant. We ate and drank to our fill, chatting about all sorts of amusing things that had happened while I was away. Naturally, the topic of Diego and Rita came up. Ever since Diego married Rita, it was as if he had been cursed. He lost his secure teaching job and, after much effort, managed to land a position as a librarian. But even that didn't last. One day, Rita caught him chatting with a female coworker. Without a word, she grabbed the woman by her hair and attacked her. The incident not only humiliated Diego but also cost him the job. Rita, taking advantage of her pregnancy, escaped any consequences. This emboldened her further, and soon, no one in the neighborhood wanted anything to do with their family. There were plenty more stories like that. Diego must be regretting it so much now. Yes, especially when he let someone like Bianca go. Everyone instinctively glanced at me. I smiled nonchalantly, completely unbothered. After the meal, everyone gradually dispersed. "Bianca!" A voice suddenly called my name. I looked up. Diego was standing on the other side of the road, looking at me. In the 5 years since I last saw him, he had aged considerably. His hair had turned gray at the temples, and his once straight posture had a slight hunch. The look in his eyes shimmered with a complex mix of emotions. "Bianca, I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those words." I realized he might have been reborn as well. As for his apology, I didn't think it was truly meant for me. It seemed more like a confession to himself, his regret over how this life had defied the expectations and fantasies he had in his previous one. The price he paid was too great, and the result was too bitter. So, he regretted it. "Diego! Diego!" Rita's sharp voice echoed from the alley behind him. Hearing it, Diego's eyes flashed with frustration and impatience. It was as though her voice carried a curse. I never thought I would see the day when Diego, who once cherished Rita above all else, would show such an expression toward her. The moment Rita appeared, chasing after him, I turned and walked away. Behind me, her shrill voice rang out, "Diego, are you here to see that slut Bianca? I'm telling you, as long as I'm alive, you'll never be with that slut. Diego, don't even think about getting rid of me in this lifetime. If I have to die, I'll make sure you die with me. Diego." Say you love me. If you don't, I'll jump right here and now. The sounds of her screaming, crying, and fighting gradually faded into the distance. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in my mind. In our previous life, Diego had left too hastily, and I never had the chance to tell him. Rita had a severe hereditary mental illness. Why it didn't manifest in our previous life was probably because she had been alone and basking in the glow of love. I reached the end of the street and looked up at the sky filled with stars. In the vast sea of stars, there would always be one shining just for me, and my future was bright with promise.